I finished Demon Slayer a little while ago and it was so much better than I expected. So now I want to do 3D renders of the main trio, beginning with Inosuke.
Hey! Fight me! Fight me!
So normally right now we'd be in Zbrush or Blender doing the Blockout, but instead I wanted to jump into posing first. Now I know that sounds a little bit different, but there's this website called Plast.ai and it allows anyone to be able to motion capture from their homes because all it requires is a webcam. About a year ago I tested it out. I wasn't expecting too much. The only thing I knew going in was that it used AI to process the footage and I was pleasantly surprised. That plus the fact that it's free are huge selling points for me. If you guys wanted to test it out, just make a free account and embrace your characters like you're about to see me do. I'm just going to walk you through the steps. Hit mocap at the top of your screen, and at this stage you can either choose to use a webcam or browse to a file. We're going to browse to the file and then hit extract on the right hand side of the screen, as long as it's only you. If it's not, then you can change the options. Now Plast is going to then ask you to rename that file, and then it's going to begin extracting the motion. Now we're back on the 3D screen where we can see our files on the left hand side. Click and drag one of your motions over to the mannequin so that we can preview it and make sure everything looks good. Once we're happy with that, right click on the mannequin, press export, and then pick the motion that you wanted and pick the file format that you want as well. Inside of Blender we're going to import that file that we just saved and everything's going to work as soon as you hit play. The next things I like to usually do is click on the spine bone and the hip bone and just move the mannequin to a position that I like. Make sure to use bounding box and not individual origins or anything like that. After that, I'll just select all the joints and refine the pose because hands and things like that don't get animated in the process. Also remember to delete the keyframes on all the bones so you can manipulate everything without it resetting. Once I'm happy with the pose, I'll move on to the Blockout. I'm doing this in Blender this time, mainly to get used to the program, but there's other advantages like the actual 3D camera. The biggest advantage for me though is the fact that I can do look dev while I'm modeling or while I'm sculpting, so I can go to the actual render view like you're seeing here and test it out with lighting. At this early stage, experimenting is the most important thing you can do, so be flexible and be fast. You can see all I'm doing is basic sculpting. I'm using vertex paint but only with flat colors because, to be honest, I like the look of it in the render. And later on I'm going to use the particle hair again just to explore the look. Do I want my fur to be sculpted or do I want it to be simmed? It's also the same question with translating anime character. Do I want it realistic or do I want it stylized? Usually I fall somewhere in between, but again, experimenting is the way I find which direction I want to go in with any project. Okay, now we're back in Zbrush. The main objective is to get everything polished. We want the silhouette to be as deliberate as possible, and you can see all those little bumps and lumps in the surface. We just want to make sure those are gone. We're also adding more geometry where it's needed, for example around the eye, and we're making the poly paint that we had look more deliberate, just because we can use more geometry in Zbrush and it's easier to maneuver. Other areas we're sharpening up. You know, anime always has that distinct silhouette, so we want to capture that. For the anatomy, I think I already made it up in my mind that I'm going to go more realistic than the head. So hair, I block out the primary and secondary forms. I don't necessarily go to tertiary or detail because I don't think it's necessary for what we want. We want to just show the power of Inosuke. We don't need to show all the detail on him. And to show power, we just need to exaggerate those muscles and the veins to make sure that that pushes through. For the sword, we're going to stick to ZBrush. We're going to take advantage of the Z modeler brush and live booleans to create the serrated edges on the blade. This is actually the shape I'm going to use for it, and later on we're going to duplicate that. You can see here I extracted a piece of geo off the surface, and then we're just going to use that to sculpt. I used the slice tool to make separate poly loops, and then I just sculpted on it as we went. So these are those serrated edges, and I just extracted another piece of geo around that because it looked a little empty. Now we're taking advantage of Goal B and using that to get our mesh back over to Blender where I can test it out. Now later on we do make changes to this because I'm not a fan of how the light's currently reflecting off of a sword. So we change the direction of the hand and the blade. This is the advantage of utilizing look dev while you're working throughout the entire process, because if I wasn't checking lighting along the way I wouldn't have known how it reflected. So I would have changed it at the end and been a lot more reluctant, because in my head I would have been finished. So just check along the way. I was liking the direction we were heading in. The pose, the tension, the fur, that all worked for me. But the head didn't work for me yet, and the lighting quality didn't work for me yet. For the head, I stepped away from the sculpted hair and decided to use the particle hair system in Blender. This meant that I could step away from the anime style while adding visual interest, which I was a fan of. This also forced me to switch from Eevee to Cycles because Eevee wasn't doing a good enough job at rendering the really fine hairs. So that fixed both of my issues, because the lighting in Cycles looked a lot more dynamic. I did end up making small tweaks, but it was just the better calculations of Cycles that ultimately made it look better. Now finally at this stage I wanted to add secondary motion to the piece. I experimented with tons of different ways of doing things, and ultimately I went with adding motion blur to the camera. This meant that I could add motion blur both to the sword and other elements in the scene fairly easily.
So whilst my husband has lost his voice, I want to say thank you for watching, and if you want to see more, check out his making of the Joker video.